What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making a pilot headset, or more specifically a David Clark headset. I've wanted to make a helicopter pilot headset for some time now, and this light green version is the first that pops up in my mind when I think of pilot headsets. So I thought it'd be a lot of fun to recreate one for this week's video. Now, of course, this whole video will be available in real time, along with all the working files and the 3D model. So if you want access to any of that, you can find it all on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. So like usual, the first thing to do was find some reference. So I jumped on Google and found a few images of similar headsets. I'll leave a link to all of these images in the description below. So after the reference was gathered, it was time to start blocking some shapes out. Now we're going into this kind of blindly. I didn't plan anything out or think about how I was going to tackle some of these shapes, so we'll have to experiment a little bit along the way to make sure everything looks and feels right. Now looking back, I would have done a few things a little bit differently, and we'll go over that later on in the video when we go over all of the UVs. For now, let's focus on blocking things out. We don't want to rush too quickly to start adding in small details, or it can make the whole process a little bit longer and tedious if we have to come back and rework some shapes. So let's take our time, try not to rush anything, and let's slowly start building up our pilot headset. So as you can see, I'm basically starting on one earpiece, and we can slowly start refining that shape until it looks more similar to our reference, and then we can duplicate it over to create the other side. Now you'll see throughout this process, I'll quickly duplicate one over just so I can start visualizing how everything is looking, but I'm not going to worry too much about the second earpiece. We're just going to focus on one side since they're basically identical. Later on in the video, once it's all finished, we can easily just duplicate it over. And we're not going to really focus on getting every shape perfect right off the bat. In fact, I find if you really focus on making one shape perfect, it can really drag out the whole process. And once you start adding in the objects around it, you usually need to come back to that original shape to refine it anyways. So what I like to do is get a shape roughly blocked out or looking similar to the reference, and then we can move on to a couple other shapes and always come back to it to refine it. I find, at least for myself, I can move a little bit quicker this way rather than just getting every shape perfect right off the bat. So we're just going to slowly start piecing these shapes together, and hopefully it will start to look more like our reference photo. And one other thing to note actually about reference is I find if you gather too much reference, it can actually make the whole process a little bit longer as well. Since every shape looks a little bit different from one another, you can really start jumping around between references and not really settling on a specific shape. So what we're going to do is just choose a few of these reference images and kind of focus on one specific shape. So for example, if you look at the microphone, they really do change throughout all these images. There's some that are round, there's some that are squared, some that are more simplified, and some that are a little bit more complex. So we're just going to find one that we naturally gravitate towards, and we're just going to start modeling that specific shape. As great as reference is, I always find that if you gather too much, it can actually overcomplicate it. So let's keep things simple and let's slowly piece together our headset. All right, so here is the David Clark headset in its finished form. Now there are a few small things that I decided to do at the very end, and we'll go over that really quickly actually before we go through the UVs. So one of the first things I did was I took this left or right earpiece and I just rotated it a little bit. It was originally mirrored from this one and they were just perfectly straight, and to be honest with you, a real life object, especially something that bends, it just wouldn't be so perfect. And in fact, I actually think it'd be closer because there'd be a lot of tension between this metal piece that's actually holding these two earpieces together. But I wanted just to leave a little bit of a gap just for the renders, but I also didn't want them to be perfect. So I took this whole piece, grouped it, and just slightly turned it or rotated it inwards. That way they're just not perfectly symmetrical. And I find things in real life are never perfect. So adding a little bit of variation between the objects, even if they're similar in shape, can make it look a lot more realistic. And besides that earpiece, I also went ahead and just basically using my soft select brush. So by pressing B on my keyboard, you can change the scale of that soft select brush. And I added just a tiny, very, very tiny bit of basically wrinkles or a little bit of wave in this pattern, just so I can change up the shape of this head resting padding piece on the top of the headset. It was just looking too stiff, and of course we can add some waves later on in our materials, later on in Substance, but just by adding a little bit into the geometry, and I find by using the soft select brush, you can really achieve some good results. Now we could have spent a little bit longer on this piece, but I ran out of time, so I find if I could go back and just continue working on it, this top little headrest piece, I probably would have spent a little bit more time on. But I just wanted to add a little bit of shape into it, as you can see with the shading. And I just added that at the very end before we jumped into the textures. Besides that, everything else is basically the exact same. Now what I decided to do was break this headset into 3 different groups for the 3 different textures applied. Now why 3? There is no real reason. To be honest with you, I was originally thinking 2. I was actually going to combine these 2 into 1. But I thought, since we're not really making this for a video game or anything, we're not limited by our texture amount, we're just going to split this into 3 so I can get a little bit more resolution out of those final renders. Especially on this headset, since I knew I was going to have some sort of leather-like material, I wanted to see those details in the leather, and of course, the higher resolution, the larger that UV shell is in our UV editor, the more resolution I'm going to have to work with. So let's go over these 3 groups. So the very first group is basically the main shapes of the headset, so the earpieces. Now, originally, if you're following along, of course, this whole video, including the full UV mapping process, will be available on my Patreon page. And if you followed along in that UV process, you'll see that originally these 2 earpieces were actually sharing the exact same UV space. And when I started texturing the shape and I added the logo on the side, I didn't even think about it when I was UVing, but it was being mirrored over. So the logo itself was actually backwards on this side. So there's a few things we could have done. Originally, I actually just cut out a little ring around, so this one little UV shell in the middle was flipped to make the logo look correct. But you could see a very tiny line in certain reflections on certain angles, and I just thought that wouldn't be right. I just wanted it to look a little bit more realistic. So I ended up taking these 2 UV shells and just basically dragging them over so they're not sharing the same UV space. That way I have different markings and materials, or little, details that are not identical on both sides, as well as that logo is going to look correct on each earpiece. So that's something I did last minute, is I just, like I said, these were originally sharing the same UV space, so I just had to shrink them down a little bit and move things around so I could basically not share the same UV space to have different textures on them. Everything else is actually sharing the same UV space, so these inside earpieces are. These metal pieces that you see here are also sharing the exact same UV space. These ones up here. So a lot of the things actually can overlap these as well. That way it was easy for me to apply materials, and since they're on different sides, you're really not going to see them at the exact same angle from the camera view. So we can get away and fake a lot of that detail. Even though they're repeating patterns, you're not really going to notice they're repeating. So on the second group and texture is basically the wire and the top headpiece. Now I wanted to enlarge this, like I said earlier, as big as I can. We could even go bigger if we wanted to, but I just wanted to get nice resolution out of that leather material. And I also, at the very end, added an extra UV cut for this tiny little piece. And my idea was I can add some height into the materials to make it look like a small little bump in that spot. In that way, we can add some cool stitching effect over top of it. Now, if I went through and basically extruded these inwards to actually create some depth, which we could have done, the only thing I thought is if we added that stitching effect over top of it, it wouldn't really look like it's actually over top of it just because there's actually an extrusion happening. So by just faking that depth, we can hopefully get a better stitching effect over top of that crease. At least that was my theory behind why I did that. And I also decided to add the tape and the cord, like I said, along with this top piece right here. And I knew I was going to add some text on top, so I wanted this to be fairly large so I can see that text nice and clear. In the last group and material is just the microphone piece. And to be honest with you, I really didn't need all this extra space. As you can see, there's a lot of unnecessary wasted space here as well that I could have probably taken advantage of, or I could have easily just combined these two into one, which I would probably do if I was going to go back and redo it. Less textures is always nice, and I don't think we really need 3 textures on an object like this, but it is what it is. So that's basically how I prepared this headset. Now, I said at the beginning of the video, there's a few things I would do differently. And one of the main things is this actual earpiece. So as you can see, I basically just added I think 2 smoothing effects to it, 2 subdivisions, which increases the poly quite a lot, and it's not really needed. And I also, throughout the process, as you see at the beginning of the video, I just basically merged all of these into one center point here. And I probably wouldn't have done that if I went back and redid it. So what I thought I would do is quickly show you, let's hide this headset. I created 2 other ones that I can show you how I would do it differently if I were to go back, or if I needed to create a game ready asset, which is a little bit more optimized and it's not as high in polys. You would normally create 2 meshes, one that's higher in poly and one that's lower in poly for in-game. So the lower poly shape, now they're over top of each other because that's how you would usually do it when you were setting these objects up in Substance Painter. But if we look at them side to side, I just want to show you the difference. So originally, I'm not merging them into one center point like I did on my model. I actually kept it quads, which I think you have a lot of cleaner results. So you're not going to see any weird artifacts in your object. And to be honest with you, even from a distance, they look pretty much identical. Of course, you can see the edging around this because it's lower in polys, but by adding one smoothing effect to this shape, you can really quickly have that smoothing effect. And if I actually added these in Substance and baked out the textures, a lot of that detail, that curvature would be transferred over to the lower poly mesh in game, so it wouldn't look as blocked out. Now, of course, you could spend a little bit more time. Like here, I have some triangles. We can figure out some ways to have this topology look a little bit cleaner. I did this really quickly just for the example. But the main difference, I think, in a shape like this is that you're having nice quads throughout this model, and you're not going to, if you go back to my original shape, you can see how they kind of merge together, which is still quads, but it's not as clean. And to be honest with you, I don't know why I just deleted those and merged them while I was modeling. It just jumped into my mind. I wasn't really thinking, but that's probably one thing I would do differently. And I also kept these all out just because you can have some really low poly models, similar to how we did it before. So I had a smaller, lower poly model and I smoothed it out to create that weird shape. Now, of course, this is not that nice of an example because I didn't refine it. So these would have to be moved up and not as deep. So this looks a little bit cleaner, but just to show you, you really don't have to smooth it out too much to get some smooth curvature. You could just increase those polys to begin with and have a little bit of a higher poly mesh. Something like this even. If I smoothed it, you really don't have to have something so dense. So just keep that in mind when you're making your shapes. You don't really have to go too crazy. I think even that would work, I think. And it's a much less polys than the one that I currently have. There's always room for optimizing basically, so depending on how your model is going to be used, you don't really need to add a crazy amount of subdivisions. And this is an example of that merge center that I did. So I wouldn't have done that, and I probably would have just kept it like this one. If you look at them side to side, you can see what I mean. Well, just those little details can go a long way. Of course, depending on how your model is going to be used, so always keep that in mind. But that's basically how I set this David Clark headset up. So I applied a material to each different group here. So later on in Substance, when we jump into the software, you'll see 3 different texture sets in my texture set list. So let's export this headset. Let's jump over to Substance Painter and we can start our texturing. All right, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in that FBX file from Maya. Now when it came to the textures, everything is pretty straightforward, and like usual, I'm going to use a lot of the built-in, or actually all of the built-in materials that come with Substance Painter, so nothing is different and everything should be available to anyone that's following along. The only thing that I had to do was add that logo. So what I did for that was jump on Google Images and found a David Clark logo just on Google Images. I brought that into Photoshop and turned it into a black and white photo. So I just basically brought the saturation all the way down and removed all the color to make it black and white, inverted it so all of the actual text of the logo is white and the background is all black. That way I can just take that image, drag it into my Substance file, set it as an alpha, and I can simply paste that logo directly onto my mesh. So just like that, you can create logos very easily, and you can usually find the brand logos on Google. And that's the only real thing I had to do differently for this model. Other than that, everything is pretty straightforward. Now, like usual as well, you're going to hear me say this in almost all my videos, I'm not going to focus on dialing in the perfect texture right off the bat. In fact, I find that can almost always drag out the process. So what I like to do is just start filling in those empty meshes with some sort of material, and then we can always come back to it and refine it. And the big reason for that is I find that when you really work on one specific shape's materials, let's say the earpiece, and I'm just really focused on getting that perfect, I spend lots of time and energy making that texture look perfect. Once I actually get in the rubber material around it or the metal that's attached to it, and all the other objects around it are starting to get textured, well, when you go back to that original shape and that original material, usually it needs more reworking because it looks a little bit different with all the other materials around it. So I always keep that in mind now when I'm texturing, is I just start filling in those meshes with some sort of material, and then I can always come back to it at the end and start refining things and making it look a little bit more accurate to my reference. Now, of course, we're not just going to throw on any object. I'm going to spend a little bit of time refining it, but I'm not going to spend all day trying to get it perfect. I'm basically going to accept the fact that it's not going to look perfect right away, and we can always come back to it and refine it afterwards. And in almost every case, at least from my experience, it makes the whole texturing process a little bit quicker that way. And that's what we're going to do in this video. We're just going to start filling in these empty white meshes with some sort of smart material, some base material that we can use as a base, some sort of foundation for our material, and then we can start adding different fill layers. We can refine those, change the colors, add more dirt and grunge on top of it, depending on how we want it to look. Now, of course, I was trying to go for a little bit more of a realistic look, not too worn out and beaten up. I know I do that a lot on this channel because I just like making my models look a little bit more worn. But in this case, I wanted to look more like it was used, but still in good condition. So we're not gonna technically beat it up and make it look post-apocalyptic or anything like that, like we like to do here. But we're just trying to make it look a little bit more realistic, like something you would see in an actual helicopter. So let's start filling in these meshes, let's start texturing these objects, and we can slowly make our headset look like a real-life David Clark headset. Don't forget, this full video will be available in real time, which will be available on my Patreon page, along with the working files. So if you're interested in opening up the Substance Painter file and taking a look at how I structured these groups, how I structured some of these materials, all of that will be available to you on my Patreon page. And you can find that in the link in the description below. All right, let's start texturing this headset. All right, and that is basically everything. That is the whole 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create this David Clark headset. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's video, and if you did, please hit that like button, and also please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the best way that you can support my work and support these videos, and you can also be notified when the next video drops. And if you would like to support me in an even bigger way and also get access to a lot of other tutorial-based videos and real-time videos and a lot of other types of different content, check out my Patreon page. I'm trying to upload there more frequently and make more specific Patreon-related videos like tips and tricks videos. And I'm going to try to upload those weekly going forward. So if you're interested in getting access to any of that, you can find it all in the link in the description below. And I also want to give a massive thank you to all of my Patreons. I really can't thank you all enough for your continuous support. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this week's video, and I will catch you in the next one.